Hey everybody, before we start today, I just wanted to say we are once again within spitting distance of 100,000 subscribers. So if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and let's get to 100K. So, it was a couple months ago that one of my friends DM'd me a link to a Twitter thread, and on that note, I will be in the cold ground before I call it X. Said thread contained links to every delisted Spider-Man game on PC, and I'm a connoisseur of Spider-Man games, having played at least the majority of them over time. So this is something that was right up my alley. I downloaded every single one of them and had a night sampling each game. Some of these were ports, some of these were unique entities that only existed on PC, some of them I've already covered on this very channel. So I thought I'd open this puzzle box and take a look at what we have. Do they hold up as games? Are they good ports? Do they even function? We'll see. A lot of these are just going to be first impressions as opposed to thorough reviews, and I'm also playing these games as is. If they work, they work. If they don't, so be it. They're all purported to work, but as you'll see, that's not necessarily the case. So let's start this out with a certified hood classic. Spider-Man 2000, one of the most fondly remembered Spider-Man games ever. I do think it's a touch overrated. The story's a bit of a mess, and the gameplay is good, but has since been surpassed by at least half a dozen Spider-Man games. It's by no means bad, but it also wouldn't be my first choice if I was on a desert island. I covered this game a while ago in this video, which you can check out, but to give a brief summary, I think that Spider-Man 2000 as well as Enter Electro are sort of the spiritual predecessors to modern Spider-Man, in that they feel like a love letter to Spider-Man lore and history in a way that was very rare for the time, and regardless of how you feel, you can't deny that the love of the IP oozes from this game's every orifice. Although while Spider-Man 2000 may be a touch overrated, modern Spider-Man is simultaneously a touch overrated and a touch overhated because the internet is where nuance goes to die. So I won't go out of my way to bore you with the bits and pieces of Spider-Man 2000 as a game. Carnage and Doc Ock team up to frame Spider-Man for robbery while infecting the whole city with poisonous fog that turns humans into symbiote monsters. Then about 1,000 subplots also take place. As a port, Spider-Man 2000 on PC is a bit odd. I mean, despite being generally able to play it, it does feel like it's barely functioning on modern systems and could crash at any second. I couldn't get the sound to work for a start, which is funny because I swear the first time I played this game, the sound did work, but I might be misremembering. Then the visuals and presentation are a bit all over the place. Despite the game obviously running at 60 FPS, certain animations don't, so the game is constantly bouncing back and forth between frame rates, which does make the game look really lurchy, and it feels like the parts of the game that do run at 60 FPS are only doing so by running at double speed. This includes the camera. Unfortunately though, this game definitely wasn't built for high frame rate. Because as was a common practice at the time, and even to this day stupidly, much of the game's functionality is tied to the frame rate. And in particular, the in-engine cutscenes, because by increasing the frame rate, it doubles the animation speed, which means animations get played out of sequence. A window breaks before the thing that breaks it even launches. Rhino charges at Spider-Man, and Spider-Man jumps over him a significant chunk of time before he's supposed to. And worse yet, there's an in-engine cutscene at the end of one of the early levels where Spider-Man falls with a crate. However, the increased frame rate makes Spider-Man fall faster than the crate, which means that Spider-Man actually falls to his death before the cue to end the level happens, rendering this level basically unbeatable. I even tried to go into my Nvidia panel and manually force this game to cap at 30 FPS, but that never works for me, and this was not an exception. That's the thing. Playing through this version of the game, I kept running into little issues that hurt the playability, which is a shame because it's still the exact same game that I know and love. The most surprising thing to me is that this actually does have controller support. Kind of. You can assign the functions manually to an Xbox 360 or even PS4 controller, however the triggers don't work for some reason, which means I had to map WebZip to L3. I feel like many of the issues with Spider-Man 2000 could be fixed with mods, but I would have to have somebody handle that for me, given the fact that I'm still fairly tone deaf when it comes to that sort of thing. Truth be told, as much as I really enjoy the base gameplay of this game, I couldn't really play this game for all that long because I kept running into issues. So if I ever feel the urge to play this game again, it won't be on PC. It'll probably be on a Dreamcast or PS1 emulator. However, if you can handle these issues or if you can find mods to fix it, then this could potentially be the definitive way to play Spider-Man 2000. I mean, it's sure as hell the highest resolution version of the game. Here we have Spider-Man 2002, a spiritual successor to Spider-Man 2000, and also Enter Electro, but not a lot of people know about that one, as it's essentially the same style of game, linear beat-em-up levels with Spider-Man mechanics thrown in, but with that said, we're now dealing with the Sam Raimi movies as a basis, so it plays the same. However, instead of having the talented voice acting chops of people like Reno Romano or Jennifer Hale, now we're dealing with the movie actors speaking like robots.
My Uncle Ben and Aunt May raised me like a son. They never had much money, though. I thought my powers could help make up for that. The last time I saw Uncle Ben alive, we argued.
Let me be clear that I have absolutely nothing against the movie actors whatsoever, and I love the Sam Raimi movies, don't get me wrong, but these aren't trained voice actors. It's a whole different skill set. And also, they're probably not putting their all into it because this is a video game tie-in, so they're probably fully aware that half-assing it isn't going to hurt their career, so the result is pretty rough, unfortunately, and that's pretty much all I can say about this game because it's the one game in this entire collection that steadfast refuses to work. Hence why you're looking at upscaled PS2 footage right now. On the PC version, I can get to the main menu and alter the settings and whatnot. The opening cinematic sort of works, but as soon as I get into gameplay, the game basically dumps me to game over immediately. This is definitely a compatibility issue with modern Windows, and unfortunately, because this is a download that works independently instead of a series of installed files, I seemingly can't install the 1.03 patch because it can't recognize that the game is on the system to begin with. I tried some other fixes, but nothing really worked, so unfortunately, this version of the game is a bit of a wash. I did recently get into emulating retro PCs, so there's a good chance I could get this to work in a more traditional sense that way, but as a download in this sense, it just refused to work for me. Moving on. Spider-Man 2 is one of the greatest superhero movies of all time, and I will not be hearing anybody argue that. I remember there was this one YouTuber I used to watch back in the day who absolutely hated the Raimi movies, and I remember kind of buying into what he was selling. His opinions were mostly based on the fact that they were incredibly inaccurate to the comics, but I also wasn't intellectually intelligent enough at the time to have my own opinion, and these days I tend to think, who the hell cares if it's inaccurate to the comics or not? It's just a well-told story that's only become more resonant with me as I've grown older and experienced burnout and relationship issues. And in fitting with the movie being so great, the video game tie-in was also one of the best movie tie-ins for the time. Almost perplexingly so, because it was at the height of terrible movie tie-in game mania. However, the great game in question was actually the console version. The PC version, on the other hand, is an entirely different beast, and I speak no hyperbole when I say that the PC version of Spider-Man 2 the game might actually be one of the worst games I've ever played. It ambitiously tries to tie in most of the major controls to the mouse, which I can appreciate in a sense, and if it had a swinging system like the console game, I could dig it. The problem is, it doesn't, and let me just say for the record, the entire reason, not the partial reason, not the majority of the reason, the entire reason the console version was so great was because of the swinging. It had really good swinging physics and built the game around it. I'm more forgiving of the other aspects of the game than most. I think the combat is actually pretty fun, especially with those retro ragdoll physics, but eliminating the swinging physics from Spider-Man 2 the game is like eliminating the steak from a steak dinner and just giving you a pile of seasoning. Instead, the entire basis of the swinging gameplay is based around these predetermined icons that you can swing between with really basic swing physics. And if you try to press the web button on any other object, you web zip to it. I mean, I can pretty much stop the review here because you can pretty much play the game for 5 minutes and understand the depth of how bad it is. If I'm being honest, words fail me in my attempts to bring across how awful this whole thing is. It makes traversal just simply no fun whatsoever, and so there's no incentive to explore. Not that there was any to begin with, because this isn't even really a proper sandbox. It's a hub-based mission-style game with hard-cut loading screens between major areas of the game, for some reason. And the combat is not much better. You walk up to a goon and press the left mouse button. There's no thought to it. It feels like the most bare-bones crap-tastic beat-em-up game you'll ever play. There's no strategy to the combat. There's no dodging, no nuance, nothing. You walk up to somebody, stand in front of them, and punch them. So basically, this is a Spider-Man game where the swinging is basically non-existent and the combat is completely weak. So what else is there? I don't know, you have occasional QuickTime events, or Simon Says mini-games for some reason, but like, is there any appeal to this game whatsoever? Honestly, hell no. Somehow above all else though, this game manages to look really cheap. Like, the CGI cutscenes run at like 10 FPS and look bad even for the time. Like, what the hell is this? And the environments look really boxy and basic. The animation and presentation is so bare bones it's not even funny. Even the menu looks basic as hell. This looks like a bootleg DVD menu. You know what? I'm gonna tell you what I think is the final nail in this game's coffin. In every one of the tie-in games to the Sam Raimi trilogy, Bruce Campbell is the tutorial voice.
Before we go any further, I think it might be a good idea to save your progress, if you could call it that. Just go to the pause menu and bring up the save load screen. Easy, right? Well then do it.
He's always a treat to listen to because he's always smarmy and sarcastic, but in this game, his sarcasm feels more pointed, as if he's literally roasting the game itself.
How about zipping over there to the checkpoint in the danger zone? Adventure awaits. In a loose sense.
And if Bruce Campbell thinks this game is bad, then what argument do you have, bucko? F*** this game. And now we have Spider-Man 3, the worst of the Sam Raimi trilogy. I think most people would agree with that. Thank you, Sony, for interfering with the movie's production. Whether you think it's a bad movie or simply the weakest of 3 great movies will vary from person to person. I remember liking this movie when I was younger, but I haven't seen it in over a decade, and like most other tie-in games I had the PS2 version of this game growing up, which was a downgraded version of the Wii version, and so it was basically 10 pounds of shit in a 5-pound bag. This version, meanwhile, isn't bad. It's not great, but it's also not bad. If you do plan on playing this version of the game, my first recommendation would be thus. Do not, I repeat, do not turn on full screen effects in the menu. I have no idea what it was supposed to do, but what it ends up doing is it completely destroys the lighting engine and makes these weird black boxes appear in the skybox. I'd love to know what the intended effect was supposed to be, however this game looks perfectly fine without the abundance of full screen effects. Okay, well, perfectly fine is a bit of a stretch given that the cutscenes in this game are some of the most memetic cutscenes in the history of video games. I mean, there's obviously things like Bomb Lady, and I deliberately failed that QuickTime event just to prove to myself that it actually happened. But some of the rigging in these cutscenes are hilariously stupid and hilariously bad. I can't possibly do it justice. You'd have to play the game for yourself to see it. Doesn't matter if you're playing in full HD on PC or not. With that said, once you're into gameplay, it looks perfectly serviceable if nothing else. I'd also imagine the frame rate is a damn sight higher than the frame rate on the console version. While the options are somewhat limited, they were par for the course for when this game came out, and while it may be a bit bare bones of a port in that regard, I didn't run into any significant issues other than the full screen effects, and as for the game itself, I can't quite be as kind. The most disappointing thing for me is the downgraded swinging physics. Sure, they're still there in the sense that you can only swing by attaching yourself to buildings, but it feels very artificial in a sense. I don't think it's possible to gain significant speed no matter how skillful your timing is. Your speed caps at a very low speed. And it feels nearly impossible to gain any elevation from your swings unless you use the boost, and the boost just serves to make the gameplay feel lurchy as all get out. I don't know why or how, but it feels like they significantly downgraded the engine from the console version of Spider-Man 2. And that sucks because this would have been something like 3 or 4 years after the previous game, so you'd think they could have just taken the exact same engine and refined it. But no, we have very heavy and unsatisfying swinging mechanics despite the fact that they still require you to swing on the buildings. Not that it really matters, because the missions seemingly do everything they can to get you into small confined areas where you can't swing properly, and dear lord, the abundance of QuickTime events in this game is ridiculous. The combat is fine, I guess. It's pretty varied, and it's always fun to hit enemies into the air and use your Spidey powers to, like, knock them around. Though I think the gameplay is a touch hard because a lot of basic enemies can do significant damage to you, and many missions require you to go through and do multiple parts in a row without any sort of health refills, but there's plenty of checkpoints and your health is restored every time you die and get reset. So they might as well give you health items for every checkpoint, but they don't. But that's all I really have to say about the Spider-Man 3 game. It's not the worst game I've ever played, the activities are somewhat varied, and the gameplay is generally functional if nothing else. It works, but it just doesn't have any oomph. And I got bored of it after a few hours, so I don't think I'll be giving it another shot in the future. You can do a hell of a lot worse, but you can also do a hell of a lot better. Such as... I'd say we're basically over the hump now. Nothing past this point can be described as completely non-functional or semi-functional. The following games will still vary in quality, but still, we no longer have to deal with complete incompatibility. Ultimate Spider-Man is, I believe, built on the same engine as Spider-Man 2, the console game, not the terrible PC port. If not, it certainly feels like it, so PC gamers can finally have at least some experience equivalent to Spider-Man 2. Well, sort of. Because playing like something is a very different thing to being structured like something, and this game has problems with structure, but I'll get into that in a minute. As far as the aspects of being on PC, Ultimate Spider-Man is a borderline perfect port. I mean, once again, the graphics options are a bit bare bones, but that's perfectly fine because I can't find any issues with any of the graphical settings. Also, for what it's worth, the pseudo-comic book aesthetic still holds up and still looks good regardless of if you're playing it in 480i or 1080p. Although I do think the frame rate does make this game run a touch fast for what's intended because some cutscenes end a second or two prematurely, but I don't mind that so much. The one thing I'm less than thrilled with, but also something that PC gaming kinda just had to deal with until like 2007, 2008, is the fact that despite having full controller support, the game still gives you keyboard inputs, and so it can be hard at a pinch to remember exactly what controller input they're referring to when a keyboard command pops up. But that's really the only drawback you have to deal with, and that's a perfectly acceptable thing to have to deal with when the rest of the game is as flawless a port as it is. And really, it's only an issue that lasts as long as it takes you to remember exactly which button command is which, and which keyboard input is the equivalent. Ultimate Spider-Man is conceptually Teenage Spider-Man from what I can understand, and from what this game attempts to convey. The game's plot is a bit too varied and episodic to recap succinctly, but basically it's an ongoing story of Venom and Spider-Man in their various exploits in New York. It's very entrenched in the Marvel universe, and so you get many story missions with cameos from people both in Spider-Man and tangential to Spider-Man, like Wolverine's boss fight out of nowhere. It kind of feels like a spiritual successor to Spider-Man 2000 in that sense, in how heavily involved the Marvel universe is. It makes the universe feel so much more grand in scope. Also, this is unrelated, but I remember hearing the voice of the main character, and I thought it sounded familiar.
You done with my butt? Hole yet? There's an idiot causing trouble a few blocks from here. I need to skedaddle.
So I looked it up and found, oh yeah, it totally is Sean Marquette, the voice of Mac from Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. I haven't thought about that show in like 20 years. I will say, the gameplay is great. The swinging physics are on point, the combat is a little bit stiff, but that's acceptable because the swinging is basically the thing that matters the most. Plus, they do kind of force you to interact with the mechanics meaningfully in a lot of cases throughout the game, in that you have to do a certain amount of side missions before you can access the main missions, which I guess makes sense, because many people would never interact with the side content unless you did this. And the side content is really good. Plus, a slightly unsung feature in this game is that unlike a lot of other Spider-Man games where you can only play around in Manhattan because it's the best place to swing around, you also have access to Queens in this game. It's not great because there aren't a lot of tall buildings, and so you find yourself swinging really low and hitting the ground a lot of the time, but for what it's worth, I do appreciate the extra added landmass. And in the spirit of additions, they also let you play as Venom for much of the game, and I'm of two minds about this. On one hand, I do enjoy the power fantasy that comes with this because he's super strong and has ridiculously OP attacks, but he also has this mechanic where his health will constantly tick down, so you have to eat people in order to recover your health, but you can still be damaged while you're eating people, so it can create this really annoying cycle of healing with zero net gain. But regardless, still a good addition, still a solid idea. So I think this game has great core gameplay, but I think where it falters is in the general progression, because a game can play absolutely fantastically, but unless you utilize that well with gameplay segments that bring the most out of the mechanics, well, you have an experience that can only ever be described as fun to play, not fun to beat. And I feel like that's Ultimate Spider-Man in a nutshell. The side content is great, but the main mission path is kind of really boring. You see, when you get down to actually playing the main game, it goes chase level, boss fight, venom level. Chase level, boss fight, venom level. Sometimes it's not necessarily in that order, and sometimes you play a chase and a boss fight as Venom, but generally those are the three types of missions you have. And that repetition is exactly why I never beat the game, even back when I had it on PS2 in high school and had all the time in the world to beat it. And also play the game. I don't think Spider-Man games have ever had a problem with repetition before this one, and I feel that it's worth it to mention that the core gameplay may be enough to carry you through the experience, and if you like the game, totally understandable. It's one of those things where I feel I'm on the verge of liking it, and with a little bit of improvement I could consider this a great game, but it does let itself down, and if you're not receptive towards repetition, then this won't be the Spider-Man game for you. But it's a game with a massive, passionate cult following, so clearly there's an audience for it. Maybe I'm not part of it, but hey, I'll be happy to pop this game on to swing around New York and do some races and collect tokens anytime. But I'm going to be avoiding the critical path. Back in the day, Spider-Man Friend or Foe was a game that I bought pretty much off the back of the fact that it was a game with a bunch of characters to play as, and as a Spider-Man nerd growing up, I dug that like a shallow grave. And as a matter of fact, originally I was gonna get the PC version, if for no other reason than because it was the only thing I owned at the time that could run it before I got a PS2. I've already covered this game in the past, so I won't go too far in depth, but I will say this is yet another case of basically having a perfect PC port. Then again, they'd be hard-pressed not to have a perfect PC port given the fact that the game is as simple as it gets. If you want your repetition, you'll get your repetition here, and unlike Ultimate Spider-Man where the game is repetitive but the engine is solid, I can't even really say the engine is all that solid here. Sure, the hits connect, the combat is functional, and the animation is smooth, but no character has more than like 2 or 3 combos and a handful of special abilities. So I'd be more surprised if they ended up having a glitched and incompatible PC port, because how the f do you f up something that simple? So here we are. As you probably know, this game is a semi-adaptation of the Raimi universe in that they reuse a big chunk of the style guide, so it feels like they were trying to trick some parents, and this game concerns some mysterious villain trying to collect all the shards of the symbiote that have fallen to Earth in order to become all-powerful. So Spider-Man, voiced by James Arnold Taylor of all people,
your top secret and your headquarters is a giant flying aircraft carrier?
Has to set out and get the symbiote shards before the army of phantoms can, and you recruit whoever can be persuaded to join you before all hell breaks loose. And yeah, you find your way through level after level, mindlessly punching enemy after enemy until the game permits you to move 6 feet to the next battlefield where you do the same thing. I swear, if you eliminate every fist fight in every level, it would take you like 2 minutes to walk through. But each level is relentlessly padded out to 20 to 30 minutes each. It's one of the most painfully repetitive games I've ever played. And what few additions they do add don't do anything meaningful to gameplay. It's just a slog to get through. There's no substantial difference between the other versions other than the resolution, but it doesn't really matter because this game is equally lame whether you're playing it in 480i or 1080p. The one difference between this version and the other versions I've played is that this version has Silver Sable as a playable character, but she's nothing special and it doesn't do anything to improve the experience. I don't know, I'm just really sick of playing this game. I know this is a game that has a cult following, but I just don't see it. And this is coming from somebody who played it a dozen times as a kid. I loved it back then, but no amount of resolution bumps is gonna make it any less boring to me in hindsight. And in fact, I kind of resent the fact that it came out on PC at all, so when I had this idea, I was obligated to play at least some of it again. Hopefully, I never have to play it again after this. Moving on. Spider-Man Web of Shadows is honestly pretty much the entire reason I even wanted to do this video, and more to the point, the entire reason why I even engaged with the thread with all these games to begin with. because Spider-Man Web of Shadows is an elusive game to say the least. It was a relatively big deal for 2008, and it's also a source of anguish for me because I got the PS2 version growing up, which is a port of the PSP version, which is a side-scroller. A decent side-scroller, but a side-scroller nonetheless, which is a real kick to the nuts when I was promised a sandbox game. With that said, however, the console version has become rare and expensive. I've seen prices upwards of $80, and that's only going to get higher as time goes on, so I'm happy to have the PC version at the palm of my hands, especially because from what I understand, the Xbox 360 and PS3 versions run pretty poorly. Meanwhile, this game works flawlessly on modern Windows and runs at 60 FPS. So not only did I get this game for free, which normally costs a ridiculous amount of money to buy secondhand, I also got the definitive experience. As a PC port, it's extremely bare bones, like crazily so. The only options you get from the launcher is the resolution and whether or not you want to turn on VSync, but I'll accept it. As appreciative as I am for things like anti-aliasing and shadow quality and whatnot, I'm simple enough that I can pretty much live with just a good resolution, frame rate, and VSync. So this time, the plot starts out fairly simple, with just a fight between Venom and Spider-Man, only for the symbiote to infect Peter, but then the plot takes on sort of an episodic element after that, dealing with several threats that gradually escalates into all-out symbiote Armageddon as Venom's symbiote starts replicating, where the entire city is taken over and all hell is breaking loose, which incidentally is where the game starts with a meme-worthy intro. So meme-worthy it became a meme, as a matter of fact. It's not the only meme-worthy thing this game has going for it, like the Black Cat QTE failures. I burst out laughing at this one.
Gotcha.
It does take a good while for this game to get going, hence why they probably felt the need to start with a flash forward, which is probably a good idea considering that this game was literally named in reference to the whole symbiote thing, and it was all over the marketing. Unfortunately, that's probably why a first impression style video is not the best way to cover Web of Shadows, because you do it a bit of a disservice by not getting into the main bulk of the symbiote invasion. It's not the greatest story in the world, but it does the job just fine. And if you're more into comics than I, which is like into comics at all, you'll probably get a lot more enjoyment out of it. And hey, I still enjoy the hell out of the Marvel Universe cameos. Wolverine, for example, plays a significant part in this game. Also Luke Cage, but I didn't really know who the hell he was back when I played the PS2 version back in the day. Thankfully, he's gotten a lot more exposure recently. However, what I find most funny about the game's plot is the fact that it concerns New York basically being taken over by an evil force and then getting locked off from the rest of the country, and while I think it was the first example of that as far as the games are concerned, I've now played 4 separate Spider-Man games where something along those lines happened. Now, I remember when I first saw interviews and whatnot for when this game was initially coming out, they were saying that it was the first game to truly make you feel like Spider-Man. And I know the whole superhero game that makes you feel like whatever superhero it's about is about as cliched as it gets these days as far as talking points. I always appreciate it when these developers aim high. I mean, Spider-Man 2 on PC didn't make me feel like Spider-Man, it made me feel like man with grappling hook and a bad back. In other words, me if I was a superhero. Would I say that Web of Shadows succeeds in that? Well, I'd say it definitely succeeds better than most. The swinging physics are actually quite impressive, especially for the time. Unfortunately, the game seemingly doesn't really take advantage of the swinging all that much. Most of this game is just combat, and to be fair, the combat is actually pretty good when it gets down to it. It doesn't start out too hot, considering that a lot of the quality of the combat comes from the moves you unlock. But once you do start unlocking them, it's a varied and interesting combat engine with hard-hitting combos and smooth action. My favorite one was the swinging kick because people went flying with those, to the point that they kind of have to give up any notion of Spider-Man not killing. Plus, you obviously have the symbiote suit, which has a different moveset, and you can switch between them basically instantaneously, so the changes integrate themselves into the gameplay pretty well. The red suit is mostly based around the web attacks, while the black suit has more to do with the strength that it gives you. The different suits also play into the main moral choice element the game plays with. At various points, you have the choice to be either good or evil, and obviously, this really only affects the endgame. Like, it might change which companions you have at any given time, but the only substantial change is to the endgame. And as tends to be the case with these styles of moral choice, it really just makes the bad ending feel unsatisfying. Thankfully though, unlike what I initially thought, whether you get the good or bad ending relies entirely on your actions and not which suit you're using. So as long as you pick the good options instead of the evil options and have more good points by the end, you're basically good as far as endings are concerned. So yeah, good swinging, underutilized, and a good combat engine fully utilized. I feel like if they really focused on the swinging a bit more, then this could have been basically an all-timer. And even without it, it looks like it could be in contention for an all-timer, but that requires a lot more thorough of a playthrough. And as I said, this is the type of game that's too grand to really give an accurate first impression. You know, as inconsistent as superhero games were before they consolidated pretty much into one franchise apiece, I do kind of miss it, because at least back when they were throwing shit at the wall to see what stuck, you didn't have to wait 5 years for the new entry to the one franchise the superhero was permitted, and more to the point, rolling the dice on whether or not the game was crap didn't sting nearly as much. I mean, it was a 7-year wait between Arkham Knight and Gotham Knights, and I know they're not part of the same series, but they are still big-budget sandbox games based in Gotham. And imagine waiting 7 years between those games only to play Gotham Knights. Now imagine if we had a few Batman games in the intermediary that varied in quality. It wouldn't have made Gotham Knights any less boring, but at the very least it would lessen the sting knowing that we're not going to have to wait another several years for the next game. Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions is a game that isn't necessarily the greatest thing in the world, but at the very least it was made during a period of time when Spider-Man games were coming out pretty much every other year. Between 2007 and 2012, we had 6 games that could at least generously be described as big-budget games come out. Now, Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions is titled very accurately. In a plot that's established so quickly it practically gave me whiplash, Mysterio is attempting to steal something called the Tablet of Order and Chaos, and it accidentally gets shattered in the ensuing scuffle with Spider-Man. Madam Web then appears apropos of nothing. Turns out the tablet has been shattered across multiple dimensions, hence the name. 4 to be precise, you have the Amazing Spider-Man Dimension, the Ultimate Spider-Man Dimension, Spider-Man 2099, and Spider-Man Noir. Madam Web then recruits the Spider-Men from all these dimensions to gather each piece of the tablet before they fall into the wrong hands. The best way to describe the plot would be that it's very comic booky. It's succinct, straightforward, ridiculous as hell, and is also pretty fun. Although having 4 separate Spider-Men quipping non-stop does get a little bit obnoxious at times. But I think it's fun if nothing else. Plus I enjoy the fact that this is basically Spider-Verse before Spider-Verse was Spider-Verse, right down to this reference.
Is that a cartoon pig?
And yes, I know that Spider-Verse was a thing before this, but I'm more so talking about the movie. As a PC port, this is basically everything you'd want. I was a little nervous because this game is purported to have a launcher, but then when I launched the launcher, it sent me straight into the game. But thankfully all the options are in the game this time, and there's more than enough here to satisfy you if you're an options nut. However, there was one major issue I encountered, which was almost genuinely crippling for the entire experience had I not been able to find a solution. For some reason, in the very first Spider-Man 2099 level, after a certain point, the entire screen will just go black. The game doesn't crash, and it will occasionally come back to life, but it essentially renders the entire game unplayable from that point forward. But somebody noted on Steam that if you set the game compatibility mode with Windows Vista and check the first 3 boxes, for some reason this fixes the issue. And shit like this is why it took me so long to get into PC gaming properly, because it truly is more art than science. But once you get past that, and it is something pretty major to get past, the game is pretty much flawless as a port. And when you get right down to it, I think this game still very much holds up graphically. I still love the semi-cel shaded aesthetics. Although I'm not sure what I think about the glossy looking symbiote suit. If I were to sum up this game in one sentence, I would say it's like friend or foe, but actually halfway decent. I mean, right down to Mysterio being the main villain. You're in linear environments where combat is more important than any level of web swinging, although there's a bit of web swinging to be had, and unlike Friend or Foe, this game actually has a halfway decent amount of combos. More than halfway decent. I'd say this combat engine is actually appealingly varied. I did have a friend of mine insist this game plays a lot like God of War, and I could see what they're talking about. Any game that maps light attack to square, heavy attack to triangle, and grab to circle are on thin ice in that regard, but on one hand, I'd say this game does enough to differentiate itself. The combat may be similar, but it also has unique traversal mechanics and even an entire stealth section, and on the other hand, I try not to compare games to God of War unless they're truly deserving, because some people get weird about that. Either way, I think this combat engine is a winner. It's got plenty of variety, the hits have a nice impact, and the controls are extremely tight. And while the different Spider-Men don't have wildly varying movesets, which I think wouldn't be reasonable to ask them to be, they do each have their own unique abilities that each differentiate the combat at least somewhat. Such as Spider-Man 2099 having a slowdown mechanic, or Ultimate Spider-Man having what amounts to Rage of the Gods. The most unique gameplay segment is definitely Noir, because his segments are basically fully stealth-based, and unfortunately these are kind of the lowlight of the game because the stealth is whack, which isn't the last time you'll hear me say that on this list. Enemies can spot you really easily, but they also forget about you after about 5 seconds, and I can't take a stealth segment seriously if you're literally caught and then the guards aren't permanently on alert after that. You can tell this segment is trying to be like the Arkham games with the distraction mechanics and the perch sitting, but to call this poor man's Arkham would be a disservice to Arkham. But otherwise, the game is perfectly serviceable in my opinion. It doesn't have the open web swinging like I want out of these games, but it also makes up for it in other aspects, namely the combat. And I think that it's a fun time to run through each of these levels fighting bits and pieces of Spider-Man's rogues gallery in pursuit of the Tablet of Order and Chaos. It's not the greatest game of all time, but it really surprised me how much I enjoyed this game. I would say this is probably on the short list for best linear Spider-Man game I've played. Thankfully though, Edge of Time was console exclusive, so I don't have any obligation to play that one. Ah yes, The Amazing Spider-Man, Sony's attempt at rebooting the Spider-Man movies after they screwed the Sam Raimi pooch. As for the video game adaptation, it appears to be an in-between quill taking place after the first movie but before the second movie. Not that they probably knew they were making a second movie at the time, and this game basically decanonizes itself immediately by showing Rhino. Because in this, Rhino is some sort of animal-human hybrid, or at least that's what he appears to be, whereas in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, the Rhino was a giant robot piloted by Paul Giamatti of all people. Animal hybrids are basically what this plot centers itself around. After Kurt Connors is locked up, Oscorp continues experimenting with combining human and animal DNA, creating several atrocious monsters along the way, and this goes about as well as you'd imagine. Some of the experiments break out, and this causes a New York-wide epidemic of animal hybrid monsters. Not the best story in the world, but it does the job. Plus, I appreciate that instead of making the game an adaptation of the movie, they decided to give it something completely different. As a PC port, this game does have a lot of options, pretty much everything you'd want, but it also is really poorly optimized. I have an RTX 3070, which sure is a few years old now, but it's still more than capable of handling 2K and 4K gaming. But this is a game from 2012 running at 1080p max settings. There's no reason that it should be running this poorly when things get busy. So I'd say that outside of the games that outright don't work, this is probably the worst port. Well, except for, well, we'll get to that. Also, it crashed a few times on me. In fact, first impressions were not kind with The Amazing Spider-Man the game, because it had a slightly overlong tutorial segment which follows on from a really overlong walking segment which you can skip, so one wonders why they even put it in. And then immediately after that tutorial segment, the game quietly crashed behind a loading screen and corrupted my save, which meant I had to do the whole thing over again. Does the game pick up at all after that? Well, much like the best Spider-Man games, this one is a sandbox once again, and the combat is actually pretty good. But mostly because it's a blatant ripoff of the punch-counter combat of the Arkham games. It even copies the stealth elements at times, but to an extremely lackluster degree because the enemy AI and visual range is laughable. I guess this game copying Arkham was because this was 2012 when everything was either an Arkham clone, a God of War clone, a Call of Duty clone, or an Uncharted clone, and people will unironically tell you that gaming was better back then. But either way, you punch people, use web, and hit the dodge button whenever you see the spider sense indication. It's pretty fast-paced, and I think that's what I find so appealing about the combat, at least at first, is that it's lightning quick as it gets. It's to the point that there were times where I actually forgot which inputs were which because things were moving so quickly I lost track. And also, whoever designed the animations for this game is obviously a wrestling fan because the combo finishers are almost always some sort of lucha libre move. I saw tilt-a-whirl arm drags, hurricane ranas, poison ranas, and even an attack that looked like a victory roll. But despite the variance in animation, it doesn't have a massive amount of substance, and so when you're doing the combat for segment after segment, it does kind of get old. Something that would alleviate this would be taking a break from the combat to give you some more stuff to do in the open world, because even the greatest combat engines in the world need a bit of a break. They should make you take pictures, swing around doing races, maybe have a few chase sequences, you know, have fun with it. I mean, sure, taking pictures is part of it, and you occasionally have a spectacular boss fight, but unfortunately, this is a game that, despite being open world, doesn't really take advantage of the world that much. First of all, the game sets most of the main missions, at least those that I played, in closed-off environments that don't take advantage of the mechanics. It's to such an extent that I wonder why they even bothered making this game a sandbox when they funnel you into linear levels so often. But then the swinging is also not exactly anything to write home about either. Much like the combat, it feels really fast. Like, the sheer velocity you get from these swings and the distance you can launch yourself is ridiculous. But it's not organic swinging. They went back to the PS1 era level swinging, where the web's basically attached to the sky and the camera's zoomed in enough that you can't really tell, but it's obvious a lot of the time that the webs aren't actually attaching to anything, especially in the odd occasion where your web attaches to something above the level of nearby buildings. And fast or not, it just doesn't feel organic. That's the most important part. Even worse is the fact that there are at least 2 buttons that basically make the game play itself, allowing Spider-Man to launch himself by himself into some nearby area. Eliminating organic web swinging is once again a killer aspect to a Spider-Man game because that's one of the inherent selling points. So between the good but repetitive combat, inorganic swinging, and a tendency to force you into linear environments instead of taking advantage of the sandbox, when this game crashed on me about 2.5 hours in, I'll admit, I really didn't have any desire to press on. It had kind of already gotten a bit boring to me by that point. It's one of those games that, based on what I could tell, is very close to being a great game, but kind of falters. And if this was the only Spider-Man game that existed, I'd probably be a lot more forgiving to it, but we've had several Spider-Man games that surpass this one, both on and off the list. I figured I'd finish this off with what could basically be considered the final big budget Spider-Man game before Marvel's Spider-Man by Insomniac games basically became the de facto only series of solo Spider-Man adventures on the market. And it's based on The Amazing Spider-Man 2 of all things. I never saw the movie, I only know it by reputation. I know that people really hated it when it came out, but then anti-current thing revisionism made the perception of it become more positive in hindsight. See also the Star Wars prequels. Now, this is another game that's really shot up in price over the past few years for reasons that I do not know. Maybe it just didn't sell well and now it's rare. Maybe there's a novelty to the game for the fact that it's the final game of its kind. As a PC port, I'd say it's pretty rough. It doesn't use up resources the way that The Amazing Spider-Man 1 does, however, it's choppy as hell. After a couple hours of this, I got frustrated and decided to look up why this game has the frame rate issues it does, and it turns out The Amazing Spider-Man 2 caps itself at 30 FPS if you turn on VSync, and in the great words of William Shakespeare, why? What possible bearing does VSync have on frame rate? To be honest as well, I don't even think it's a stable 30 FPS anyway, because I've played many games at 30 FPS that look smoother than this. This is maybe an unstable 25 FPS at best, so it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. But I suppose I'd rather have a decent frame rate than VSync, so I apologize for any screen tearing as a result of this. But with that said, no amount of optimization or customizable settings are ever going to make this game look any less crap than it does. Because even, and especially for 2014, this game has terrible presentation. I would argue it actually has worse presentation than The Amazing Spider-Man 1, or even Web of Shadows. But then again, that might also have to do with the fact that this game was probably rushed to hell. I mean, the textures on the street level are really low quality, and that's something I noticed immediately. Another thing I noticed immediately was, what the hell is up with Peter Parker's head? It's so disproportionate, he's bordering on looking like one of the Goombas from the Super Mario Bros. Movie in 1993. But then there's also the animations, which are pretty embarrassing at the best of times. Like, look at that running animation. Look at him charge up that attack. Only his arms move. Shoddy presentation aside though, I'm surprised to see this game got such negative reviews at the time. It's not a great game, but would I say it's a 4 out of 10? No, I'd say it's more mediocre than outright bad. The plot this time around is sort of an adaptation of The Amazing Spider-Man 2 while also simultaneously being a side story, centering around a killer who's killing criminals. They literally call the killer the Carnage Killer, so it's about as on the nose as it gets. And from very early on, you notice that they're obviously going for a story where Carnage is showing Peter his true desires, how Peter believes that it would be so much easier to kill these criminals instead of locking them up, because some people are beyond being rehabilitated. Even in the short time that I played this game, the story switched gears like 3 or 4 times. You can tell pretty much just based off this short sampling that it's a bit of a mess. But hey, it does make for some really funny moments. I don't know why, but this one scene in particular absolutely killed me.
I really appreciate the help, partner. Partner?
As for the game itself, I think most people would agree that swinging is probably the highlight of the game, because not only are the physics actually pretty decent, but they also do something pretty unique in that both the triggers correspond to webbing in different directions, so maximizing your speed and efficiency takes a little more effort than your average Spider-Man game, and also it's something that no other Spider-Man game does, which sets this one apart. I think they realized that this was the selling point as well, given the fact that they decided to have the gameplay be much more heavily based in the open city rather than in linear side levels. You still have linear segments, but the balance is a lot better. As far as games that let you swing around New York, this might actually be one of my first choices. But as for the rest of the game, I can't say it holds up as well as the swinging. The combat is pretty much unchanged from the previous game, just with less intricate animations, fewer lucha moves and the like, so I can't really say much on that front. It's the same punch-counter combat with special moves, finishing moves, and various unlockable moves and abilities. A little bit tiresome when you play this game immediately after the first game, but there's nothing wrong with it on that front from what I could find. But then there are the things that I absolutely do not like. The absolute worst part of the game is this weird system they implemented where vigilantism has essentially not only been outlawed, but violently outlawed, and so Spider-Man, along with anybody else attempting to commit vigilante justice, is being hunted down. However, you can stop this by committing heroic acts. However, if you don't succeed at these various heroic acts, or you ignore them, you become a menace and then you get hunted down, which is absolute crap. How does ignoring things, or at least trying but failing, increase your menace level? Worse yet, as far as decreasing your menace level, some of these missions are horrendous, like when you're rescuing people from fire. Even when you don't have to go inside the buildings, it's still pretty bad, mostly because the game sometimes has a mind of its own as far as how you move and where you move, which probably has to do with a new system of momentum they implemented where if you touch a direction while in the middle of a web zip, you'll continue your journey along wherever the game feels like taking you, but it's a whole different degree of awful when you have to be inside the buildings. Like, Jesus Christ, I can't even describe this. And you have such a narrow time limit too. It's ridiculous. Or how about this? They thought implementing conversation trees was a good idea. I think conversation trees are right up there with QuickTime events as far as brain-dead game design, because I'd rather have a non-interactive cutscene that has a conversation that flows and brings across all the necessary points than have a jarring series of short cutscenes that are activated with a button press because it's non-interactive gameplay trying to have the barest attempt at interactability when it's not that at all. It's just less organic feeling cutscenes. But even with these issues, I don't necessarily think the game is terrible or even really that bad. The combat is still perfectly serviceable if nothing else, and it's actually fairly fun to swing around the city. I've played worse Spider-Man games than this, even today, so ultimately I think The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is a bit overhated. Not terribly so, but a little bit. Though I do concede that maybe this is a game that gets worse as it goes along, I don't know. I'd have to do a more thorough playthrough, and maybe I'll do a follow-up on this video after I beat all these games and give a more thorough, in-depth look. And those were my brief thoughts on every delisted Spider-Man PC game that I suddenly had access to. This is what I appreciate about communities like this. Bureaucracy and corporate conglomerates basically ensure that history can and inevitably will be lost due to some random legal crap. But the fans will always pick up the slack where companies let it loose. Because despite being a bit of a mixed bag, all these games still deserve to be preserved and deserve to be played. And I would have never been able to do this had it not been for a couple of random people on Twitter taking it upon themselves to give these games the preservation they so rightly deserve. As I said, maybe sometime down the road I might cover these games, or at least some of these games, more thoroughly. Maybe if I really want to ruffle some feathers, I'll include Shattered Dimensions in a God of War knockoff video, but that's only if I have a particular death wish. I guess that's all I've got to say, so if you enjoy what I do here and want to support the channel, you can like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And if you want to support the channel in a more direct fashion, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as early access, Discord benefits, and exclusive content along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to Brooklyn, Dick Kickham, Ga004, FarmCat84, Raph, Ranger X, Ty Trovy, and Moncho Thenardier for going above and beyond. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.